Dog stops owner from being taken off life support, then he wakes up. How did this happen? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sterile beeping of monitors echoed in the dimly lit hospital room. Fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting pale shadows over the man lying in the hospital bed. Wires trailed from his arms and chest, feeding into machines that monitored every heartbeat, every breath, mechanized proof that life still lingered within him. Beside him sat a golden retriever, his glossy fur dulled by the weight of sadness that seemed to permeate the room. The dog's name was Max, and for days now, he hadn't moved far from his owner's bedside. His deep brown eyes were locked onto the man's unmoving form, watching for even the smallest sign, any sign, that his human might wake up. The room itself had become eerily still. A woman, the man's sister, sat in a chair by the window, staring at her hands. She had grown weary of hope. The doctor's words echoed in her mind over and over like a cruel mantra. "There's nothing more we can do." "Sir," the sister wiped at her eyes. Her voice came out in a whisper as she looked at the dog. "I don't know how to say goodbye, Max. I just don't know." Max lifted his head slightly at her voice, his ears twitching as though trying to understand the weight of the moment. He whimpered softly and turned back to his owner, nudging the man's hand with his nose. But there was no response. Just 2 weeks earlier, the man's name was Daniel, and life had always been simple for him. He wasn't one to make waves. A hard worker, a loyal friend, and an even more loyal dog owner, Daniel had found happiness in the little things. A warm cup of coffee on his porch in the mornings, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and Max's happy bark whenever he came home. Daniel had adopted Max 4 years ago. The golden retriever had been found abandoned in a park, shivering and underfed, when Daniel stumbled across him. He hadn't gone to the park intending to bring home a dog, but something in Max's eyes, a mix of fear and longing, had pierced straight through him. "Come on, buddy," Daniel had said that day, kneeling down and holding out his hand. "You're coming home with me." Max had hesitated for only a moment before inching closer, his tail wagging weakly. From that day forward, the two had been inseparable. Daniel often joked that Max was less of a pet and more of a shadow, following him everywhere, from the grocery store to hikes up the mountains. Their bond had grown into something deeper, something unshakable. Max was family. Daniel's accident had come out of nowhere. One moment he had been fine, heading to work, sipping his coffee, and the next, everything had changed. It had been a rainy morning, the roads slick with water, when Daniel's car skidded on a curve. The crash had been catastrophic. By the time the ambulance arrived, Daniel was unconscious. Max had been waiting at home that day, curled up by the front door. He always knew when Daniel was due back, and on the days his owner was late, Max would get restless. That day, as the minutes turned to hours, Max began to pace. He whined softly at the door, scratching at the wood as if begging someone to open it. When Sarah finally came to let him out that night, the golden retriever bolted past her, running to Daniel's car, parked in the driveway, then back to the house, as though expecting Daniel to emerge. "Max," Sarah had said softly, kneeling down and running her hand over his fur. "He's not coming home tonight. He's hurt." Max let out a low whimper, his head drooping as though he understood exactly what she meant. The days following the accident had been a blur. Daniel was rushed to the hospital, placed in intensive care, and put on life support. Doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him, but the damage was extensive. "We're doing everything we can," they assured the family. Sarah and Daniel's parents took turns sitting by his bedside, holding his hand and talking to him as though their voices might somehow reach him through the darkness of his coma. But Max never left his side. It had taken some convincing to let the dog stay in the hospital room, but the staff quickly realized Max was unlike any other pet. He was calm and quiet, lying silently at Daniel's feet or curled up beside his bed. Nurses often caught him resting his head against Daniel's hand, watching him with an expression that almost seemed human, filled with hope, sadness, and love all at once. One nurse, an older woman named Carol, had become particularly fond of Max. "He's special," she told Sarah one evening as they sat in the room together. "Animals know things. They can feel things we can't. I think he's waiting for something. Sarah had looked at Max, who was staring at Daniel as though willing him to wake up. Waiting for what? She asked softly. Carol smiled faintly. For him to come back. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Daniel's condition hadn't improved. The doctors called a meeting with the family, their faces somber as they explained the situation. I'm afraid we need to start considering end-of-life options, one doctor said gently. Daniel's brain activity is minimal. There's no guarantee he'll ever wake up. I know this is difficult, but sometimes letting go is the kindest choice. Sarah's hands trembled as she listened. She looked at her parents, their faces pale and stricken. No one spoke. Max, who had been lying quietly by Daniel's bed, let out a sudden bark. Everyone turned to look at him. He was sitting up now, his ears pinned back as he stared at the doctor, almost as though he understood what was being said. The doctor shook his head and smiled faintly. Dogs really do love unconditionally, don't they? Sarah couldn't bring herself to smile back. That night, the family sat together in the hospital room, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Daniel's mother held his hand, her eyes filled with tears. I don't want to lose him, she whispered. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, looking at Max, who was still perched near Daniel's side. She reached out to run her fingers through his fur. What do we do, Max? She murmured. What would Daniel want? Max looked up at her, his eyes deep and sorrowful. Then, as though he'd made up his mind, he stood and pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Sarah watched in surprise as Max began to whimper softly, his nose nudging at Daniel's hand over and over again. It was as though he were trying to wake him up. Max, stop, Sarah said softly, reaching out to pull him back. But the dog refused to budge. He barked again, louder this time, then let out a low, mournful howl that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. What's gotten into him? Carol, the nurse, asked as she entered the room. Sarah shook her head, her heart racing. I don't know, he's never done this before. Max barked once more, then turned his head toward Daniel's face. His tail wagged faintly as though he'd seen something no one else could. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Wait, she whispered. She leaned closer to Daniel, her breath catching as she stared at his face. There, so faint it might have been mist, she saw it. A twitch. His eyes, she gasped, turning to Carol. I think I saw him move. Carol rushed to Daniel's side, her eyes widening as she checked the monitors. The heart monitor, which had been steady for days, now beeped slightly faster. Get the doctor, Carol called out, her voice trembling with excitement. Now. Max barked again, his tail wagging furiously as though he knew what he had done. The room erupted into a flurry of movement. Nurses poured in, checking Daniel's vital signs, while the doctor rushed back to his bedside. Sarah stood frozen, her hand pressed against her mouth as she watched the machines suddenly come alive. His heartbeat, it's stronger, one nurse exclaimed, disbelief in her voice. He's responding. The doctor leaned over Daniel, shining a small flashlight into his eyes and studying him closely. Daniel, he called softly, as though the sound of his voice might pierce through the darkness Daniel was trapped in. Can you hear me? Daniel, if you can hear us, try to move. The room fell silent, save for the steady beeping of the machines and the soft whimpers from Max, who had yet to leave Daniel's side. And then it happened. A twitch, a flicker of movement in Daniel's hand. It was barely perceptible at first, but enough to send waves of shock through the room. Sarah grabbed Carol's arm, her voice trembling. Did you see that? He moved. I know he did. The doctor, stunned but composed, nodded. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, but this is promising. Max let out a bark, a loud, triumphant sound that seemed to echo through the entire hospital wing. He nudged Daniel's hand again, this time licking it, as though urging him to wake up fully. And then, to everyone's astonishment, Daniel's fingers twitched again. This time, it wasn't just a reflex. Sarah dropped to her knees beside the bed, tears streaming down her face as she took her brother's hand in hers. Daniel? Daniel, can you hear me? It's me, Sarah. Daniel's eyelids fluttered faintly, his face contorting as though struggling to escape from a deep, unrelenting sleep. The machines beeped faster now, signaling a surge in his vitals. "Keep talking to him," the doctor instructed, his voice soft but firm. "He's fighting his way back." Sarah gripped Daniel's hand tightly, her voice breaking as she spoke. "It's okay, Denny. You're safe. We're all here. Max is here too. He never left you." At the sound of his name, Max barked again, this time more excited, his tail wagging furiously. And then, as though those simple words had been the key to unlocking something deep within, Daniel's eyes slowly opened. The room froze. Sarah gasped, leaning closer. "Danny?" Daniel's gaze was unfocused at first, his breathing shallow, but then his eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the sound of his sister's voice. He blinked once, twice, before his lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "Max?" A sob escaped Sarah as she clutched his hand, her tears falling onto the sheets. Yes, Max is here." "Oh my God, Danny, you're back?" Max, as though understanding, placed his front paws on the bed and licked Daniel's hand gently, his whimpers turning into soft, joyful sounds. The doctor stepped back, his expression a mix of astonishment and relief. This is remarkable. We've seen patients regain consciousness before, but this," he looked at Max, "it's like he knew." The days that followed were nothing short of miraculous. Daniel was still weak, but his recovery was progressing faster than anyone could have predicted. He could speak now, albeit in short sentences, and was able to sit up with help. Each day, his strength grew, and his doctors marveled at his resilience. But no one marveled more than Sarah. One afternoon, as she sat by Daniel's bedside, he turned his head slightly to look at her, his voice still soft but stronger than before. "What happened?" Sarah smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You were in a coma, Danny. For weeks. The doctors, they didn't think you'd wake up." Daniel frowned faintly, as though trying to process the information. Why am I here now?" Sarah glanced down at Max, who was lying on the floor with his head resting on Daniel's feet. "Because of him," she whispered. "Max never gave up on you. He wouldn't let us give up either." Daniel looked down at his loyal companion, his eyes glistening. Max's tail wagged gently, as though acknowledging the praise. "I remember," Daniel murmured. "I don't know how, but I remember him. I could hear him barking. It was so far away, but I could hear it." Sarah nodded, her voice trembling. "I think he was calling you back to us." Daniel reached down, his hand shaky but steady enough to scratch Max behind the ears. "You saved me, buddy," he said softly. "You really did." Max let out a soft bark, his tail thumping against the floor. Word spread quickly through the hospital about what had happened. Staff members came by Daniel's room just to meet the golden retriever who had seemingly defied all odds. Nurses would pause to scratch Max's head and whisper words of admiration. "You're a hero," one of them said one afternoon, kneeling down to hug him. "You really are." News outlets soon picked up the story. It wasn't long before a reporter arrived to interview Daniel and his family. "So let me get this straight," the reporter said, her eyes wide with awe as she glanced between Daniel and Max. "Your dog stayed with you every single day while you were in a coma, and then, just as the doctors were about to take you off life support, he barked so loudly that it stopped everything?" Daniel smiled faintly, his hand resting on Max's head. "That's what they tell me," he said. "I don't remember much, but I do remember hearing him. It was like he was pulling me out of the darkness." The reporter shook her head in amazement. "I've heard of dogs being loyal, but this is incredible." Sarah, sitting beside Daniel, added softly, "He's not just a dog. He's family." Over the next few weeks, Daniel's recovery continued. Each day, Max was by his side, whether in the hospital room, in therapy sessions, or during walks outside as Daniel regained his strength. Doctors, while still baffled, came to believe that Daniel's recovery had been aided by a combination of factors: his physical strength, the care he received, and the undeniable power of his bond with Max. Sometimes, one doctor admitted, science doesn't have all the answers. And that's okay. What matters is that you're here. On the day Daniel was finally discharged from the hospital, Max was the first to greet him as he stepped outside. The golden retriever jumped up, placing his paws on Daniel's shoulders and licking his face. Daniel laughed, tears in his eyes as he hugged his loyal companion tightly. "You never gave up on me, did you?" he murmured. Sarah smiled as she watched the two of them together. "Some heroes don't wear capes," she said softly. "Sometimes they wear fur." Life after the hospital wasn't easy at first. Daniel had been bedridden for weeks, and simple tasks like standing, walking, and even moving his arms felt like learning everything from scratch. But Max was there, every step of the way. On their first day home, Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, a little out of breath after walking just a few steps. Max, as though sensing his struggle, sat at Daniel's feet, his golden head resting on his owner's knee. "You're going to be my therapist, huh?" Daniel teased, running his fingers through Max's fur. "I don't think you know how much you've already done for me." Max wagged his tail as if to say, "I'm not done yet." The first few weeks were a blur of physical therapy and doctor visits. Daniel had a list of exercises to do each day, and Max had unofficially appointed himself as his supervisor. When Daniel sat on the floor stretching, Max would lie beside him, rolling onto his back as though he wanted to participate. When Daniel practiced walking, Max padded alongside him, matching his pace, his warm brown eyes constantly watching to make sure his owner was okay. It wasn't just physical support that Max gave. Emotionally, Daniel was still grappling with what had happened to him. The coma, the accident, it had left scars deeper than any the eye could see. He had been teetering on the edge of death, and somehow, Max had brought him back. That thought often kept Daniel awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying fragments of the darkness he'd been trapped in. One night, as Daniel lay there, his chest heavy with unspoken fears, Max jumped onto the bed and curled up beside him. It wasn't unusual, Max had been sleeping next to him for weeks, but tonight, Daniel felt something more. He turned his head slightly and looked at Max, who blinked back at him with eyes that held no judgment, no questions, only understanding. "Did you know?" Daniel whispered softly, his voice breaking. "When everyone else was ready to let me go, did you know I could come back?" Max let out a soft sigh, his head resting on Daniel's arm. Daniel swallowed hard and reached out to stroke Max's fur. "I owe you everything, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know why you stuck with me, but you did." Max's tail wagged faintly against the blanket, as though telling him that no reason was needed, that loyalty was just who he was. News of Max's story had spread far and wide, and soon, the local community began to take notice. People would stop Daniel and Max on their walks, asking about the accident and the incredible bond that had saved his life. "I read about you too in the paper," an elderly woman told Daniel one afternoon as he and Max made their way through the park. "That dog of yours? He's a miracle worker." Daniel smiled down at Max, who was sniffing a patch of grass with his usual enthusiasm. "He's more than that," Daniel replied. "He's my best friend." A young girl approached shyly, clutching a notebook. "Can I pet your dog?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded, crouching down carefully to join her. "Go ahead. He loves people." As the girl knelt down and gently scratched Max's ears, she looked up at Daniel. "He's a hero, isn't he?" Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, he really is." "Do you think he knew you were going to wake up?" she asked innocently. Daniel hesitated, glancing at Max. "I think he never stopped believing," he said finally. "And maybe that's all it takes sometimes, someone to believe in you, even when you can't believe in yourself." The girl smiled, nodding as she hugged Max one last time before running back to her family. Daniel stood up slowly, watching her go. "You hear that, Max?" he murmured, scratching the golden retriever's head. "You're famous now." Max barked happily, his tail wagging so hard it thumped against Daniel's leg. Months passed, and Daniel's recovery continued. The progress was slow but steady. With each step he took, with each milestone he reached, Max was there, his constant companion and cheerleader. One evening, Sarah came over for dinner. She hadn't seen Daniel this healthy and this happy in months. As they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, she turned to her brother. "You know, Danny," she said softly, "what happened to you, it changed everything." Daniel glanced at her, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Sarah smiled faintly, looking down at Max, who was lying contentedly at Daniel's feet. "It's like Before the accident, life just moved along. You were always steady, always reliable, but I don't think you realized how much you meant to everyone. Daniel frowned, considering her words. After the accident, Sarah continued, I saw how many people came together for you. Friends, family, even strangers who heard about Max. You have no idea how many lives you've touched, just by being you. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze shifting to Max. I didn't do anything special, Sarah. I just lived. She shook her head. You don't see it, but Max did. He knew you were worth saving. And because of him, you got a second chance. Daniel leaned down, ruffling Max's fur affectionately. I guess we both got lucky then. Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. More than lucky. You've got a miracle sitting right at your feet. That night, as Daniel sat alone in his living room, he watched Max curl up on the rug, his soft snores filling the quiet space. For the first time in months, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He reached for a notebook and pen, something he hadn't done in a long time. As Max snoozed nearby, Daniel began to write. Not a journal entry, not a letter, just words that flowed straight from his heart. Sometimes, when you're at your lowest, you realize who's really there for you. For me, it was my dog. I don't know what Max saw in me that no one else did, but he fought for me when I couldn't fight for myself. He believed when everyone else stopped believing. And somehow, he brought me back. Not just to life, but to the things that matter, to hope, to love, to everything I thought I'd lost. He saved me, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure he knows how much he means to me. Daniel set the pen down, wiping at his eyes as he looked at Max, who had opened one eye lazily as though checking on him. Go back to sleep, buddy, Daniel murmured with a smile. You've done enough for today. Max wagged his tail faintly before drifting off again. And as Daniel sat there, listening to the comforting rhythm of Max's breathing, he realized that sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from grand gestures or extraordinary events. Sometimes, they come from the quiet, unwavering loyalty of a friend who never gave up on you, no matter what. The following week, Daniel received a call from the hospital. It was the same doctor who had cared for him while he was in the coma. The tone of the call was curious, a mix of casual conversation and subtle intrigue. Daniel, I hope you're doing well, the doctor began. There's been something we've been thinking about. Your recovery, it's nothing short of remarkable. Your case has been unique, to say the least. Daniel shifted on the couch, Max's head resting on his lap. What do you mean, doctor? Well, many of us in the hospital haven't stopped talking about it. Max's role, it's extraordinary. We don't usually see patients pulled back the way you were, and it's made us consider how important emotional connections are to healing. Daniel looked down at Max, who blinked up at him with gentle eyes. You're saying it wasn't just medicine? There's no denying our medical intervention helped. But that dog of yours played a part we can't explain. The doctor chuckled softly. We've been talking about studying cases like yours more closely. Animal-assisted therapy is something we've always supported, but this is something else entirely. Daniel smiled faintly. I don't think Max would care much for lab coats and research papers, Doc. Maybe not, the doctor agreed, but he's made a believer out of a lot of us. After the call ended, Daniel leaned back and stared at Max, who thumped his tail lazily on the floor. You hear that, boy? You're a medical marvel. Max gave a happy bark in response, earning a chuckle from Daniel. Life began settling into a routine, but it was a new kind of normal for Daniel. Max wasn't just a pet anymore, he was his partner in every sense of the word. Everywhere Daniel went, Max followed, whether it was to the park, the grocery store, or even doctor's appointments. People in the neighborhood had started recognizing Max. Children would point and wave, calling him the miracle dog, while neighbors would stop to pet him and ask Daniel how he was doing. One afternoon, as Daniel and Max walked through the park, a small crowd had gathered near a bench. A little boy, no older than 6, was crying while his mother knelt beside him, trying to console him. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then walked over. Is everything okay? He asked gently. The woman looked up, her expression a mix of worry and relief. He fell and scraped his knee, she explained. He's scared and I can't get him to calm down. Daniel glanced at the little boy, who was clutching his mother's shirt and crying softly. Max, ever intuitive, stepped forward and sat down in front of the boy. He tilted his head and wagged his tail gently, his big brown eyes soft and reassuring. The boy's cries slowed as he looked at Max, his tiny hands reaching out instinctively to touch his fur. Max licked the boy's hands softly, making him giggle through his tears. "See?" Daniel said, crouching down beside them. "Max says everything's going to be okay. He's a good judge of these things." The boy wiped at his face, his sobs turning into sniffles as he pet Max's head. "Is he magic?" he asked shyly. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, I think he might be." The woman let out a relieved sigh, placing a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how he knew, but he's amazing." Daniel looked at Max, pride swelling in his chest. "Yeah, One evening, Sarah invited Daniel and Max over for dinner. The family had gathered to celebrate Daniel's progress, and Max, as usual, was the guest of honor. Kids ran up to him with treats and toys, while adults shared stories about how his incredible bond with Daniel had touched their lives. After dinner, Sarah pulled Daniel aside and handed him a small box. "What's this?" Daniel asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just open it," Sarah said with a smile. Inside the box was a gold medallion, engraved with a paw print and the words "Hero of Hearts." Daniel looked up at her, his throat tightening. "You didn't have to do this." "We wanted to," Sarah said. "You might think Max is just your dog, but he's so much more than that. He's a reminder of hope for all of us." Daniel turned the medallion over in his hands, blinking back tears. "I don't deserve him." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "He thinks you do." Daniel knelt down and clipped the medallion onto Max's collar. "You hear that, buddy? You're official now." Max barked joyfully, his tail wagging so hard it looked like it might knock something over. The room filled with laughter, but Daniel stayed quiet for a moment, his hand resting on Max's back. He understood now. Max hadn't just saved his life, he had given it new meaning. Months turned into a year, and Daniel had fully recovered. His life was better now, more intentional, more grateful. He volunteered at the hospital, spending time with patients who felt lost or hopeless, often bringing Max along as a therapy dog. Word had spread about Max's story far beyond their small town. Daniel received emails and letters from strangers all over the country, people who had been inspired to hold on to hope because of what Max had done. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a father whose son was recovering from surgery. "Dear Daniel and Max, we read your story together in the hospital. My son, Tommy, has been struggling to stay positive, but he says he wants to be strong like you and your dog. Thank you for sharing your story, you've given us hope." Daniel wiped at his eyes as he read the letter aloud to Max. "You're changing lives, buddy," he whispered. "One paw at a time." Max licked Daniel's hand, his eyes warm and knowing. On a sunny spring morning, Daniel sat on the porch, watching Max chase a butterfly through the grass. For a moment, he let himself reflect on everything that had happened. The accident, the coma, the moment Max refused to let him go. It was a story he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not just because it was miraculous, but because it reminded him of something he had almost forgotten. Life was a gift, and sometimes, the ones we love the most are the ones who help us see it again. As Max bounded up the steps, panting and happy, Daniel scratched his ears and smiled. "You saved me, Max," he said softly. "And I promise I'll never take this second chance for granted." Max sat down beside him, his tail wagging slowly as the two of them watched the world go by. In that quiet moment, Daniel knew he didn't need grand answers to explain what had happened. Some bonds, he realized, were just too powerful to break. And that was enough. The days stretched into weeks, and life became simpler yet more meaningful for Daniel. Mornings were filled with long walks through the park, Max's tail wagging happily as they greeted the familiar faces of neighbors. Evenings were spent curled up on the couch, where Max would lie with his head on Daniel's lap, content just to be close to him. It wasn't just Daniel's life that had changed, it was the lives of those around him, too. People who had heard his story began to see their pets in a new light, understanding that the bonds we share with animals are more powerful than words can explain. One afternoon, as Daniel and Max strolled down their favorite path, they saw a woman sitting alone on a bench, tears streaming down her face. Daniel hesitated for a moment before walking over, Max padding alongside him. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked gently. The woman looked up, startled, before wiping at her cheeks. "I lost my husband recently," she admitted softly. "It's been hard. I feel so alone." Daniel nodded, understanding the pain in her voice. "I'm sorry for your loss." Max, sensing the woman's sadness, trotted up to her and rested his head gently on her knee. The woman gasped, her hand moving instinctively to stroke his soft fur. "He's beautiful," she murmured. Daniel smiled faintly. "His name's Max. He's been through a lot, just like me." The woman looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Daniel sat down beside her and shared his story, the accident, the coma, and the way Max had refused to give up on him. He talked about the bond they shared and how Max had brought him back to life when no one else could. By the time he finished, the woman's tears had stopped, replaced by a small, hopeful smile. "It's funny," she said softly. "I didn't think I'd ever feel peace again. But your story, it gives me hope." Daniel looked at Max, who wagged his tail as if to say, "Mission accomplished." "You're not alone," Daniel told her gently. "Sometimes all we need is someone, or something, to remind us that we're stronger than we think." The woman nodded, her hand still resting on Max's head. "Thank you," she whispered. "Both of you." As Daniel and Max walked away, he felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about what Max had done for him, it was about what they could do for others too. Months later, Daniel received an invitation from the hospital. They were holding a special event to celebrate the power of animal-assisted therapy, and they wanted Daniel and Max to share their story. The event was held in a large auditorium, packed with doctors, nurses, patients, and families. Daniel stood at the front of the room, Max sitting calmly at his side with his golden coat gleaming under the lights. Taking a deep breath, Daniel began to speak. "I'm not a doctor, and I'm not a scientist," he started, his voice steady. "But I know what it's like to be at the edge of death. I know what it's like to feel like there's no way out." He glanced down at Max, who looked up at him with unwavering loyalty. "This dog," Daniel continued, his voice softening, "refused to give up on me. When everyone else had lost hope, he held on. I don't know how he knew, but he did. He sat by my side, day and night, and somehow, his presence brought me back." The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. Animals have a way of seeing us, really seeing us, when no one else can. They don't judge, they don't question, and they don't give up. Max didn't just save my life. He gave me a reason to live again. A ripple of emotion moved through the crowd as Daniel's words sank in. "So if there's one thing I've learned," Daniel finished, "it's that the bonds we share with animals are powerful. They remind us of the best parts of ourselves: kindness, loyalty, and love. Max taught me that sometimes, miracles come on four paws and with a wagging tail." The room erupted into applause, and Daniel looked down to see Max wagging his tail excitedly, as though he knew the moment was about him. After the event, people lined up to meet Max, petting him and thanking Daniel for sharing their story. Children hugged him, parents took photos, and elderly patients whispered tearful words of gratitude. "Your story gave me hope," one man told Daniel, shaking his hand. "Thank you for sharing it." Daniel smiled and looked down at Max. "I didn't do it alone." That night, as Daniel sat on the porch with Max lying beside him, he watched the stars flickering above. The world was quiet, the air cool and crisp. "You're something special, you know that?" Daniel said softly, running his hand through Max's fur. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved me. And now, you're saving so many others too." Max let out a contented sigh, his eyes closing as he rested his head on Daniel's knee. Daniel leaned back and looked up at the sky, a sense of peace settling over him. For so long, he had been searching for answers, trying to understand why Max had refused to give up on him, why he had been given a second chance. But now he realized the answers didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they shared, the love that had pulled him back to life. And as Max slept beside him, Daniel made a silent promise. He would live every day with gratitude, with purpose, and with love. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come with flashing lights or grand gestures. Sometimes they come quietly, on four paws and with a heart full of unwavering loyalty. And for Daniel, that was more than enough. The next morning, Daniel woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The sunlight streamed in, casting a soft glow across his room. Max, as always, was lying at the foot of the bed, his eyes fluttering open as Daniel stirred. "Morning, buddy," Daniel said, stretching. Max lifted his head and gave a gentle wag of his tail, his version of a good morning reply. As Daniel got up and went about his day, he couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed since the accident. It wasn't just about surviving the coma anymore. It was about truly living. Max had shown him that every day was a gift, a chance to make the most of the moments he'd been given. Later that afternoon, Daniel decided to visit the local shelter where he had adopted Max years ago. It had been on his mind for a while. He wanted to give back to the place that had brought Max into his life. Walking through the shelter's front doors, Daniel was greeted by the familiar smell of dog kibble and the sound of barking echoing through the halls. A kind-looking woman at the front desk smiled warmly as he approached, Max trotting faithfully at his side. "Can I help you?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "I'd like to volunteer, if that's okay. I know how much these dogs mean to people. They saved my life, after all." The woman's expression softened. "You're more than welcome to help. And who's this handsome boy?" Daniel grinned, scratching Max behind his ears. "This is Max. He's the hero of this story." As they walked through the shelter, Daniel saw rows of dogs staring back at him, some hopeful, others wary, but all deserving of love. A small brown puppy caught Max's attention, barking excitedly as Max approached his kennel. The shelter worker chuckled. "Looks like Max has made a new friend." Daniel crouched down to take a closer look at the puppy, who wagged his tail so hard it looked like he might fall over. "You've got a lot of energy, don't you?" Daniel said, smiling. The worker nodded. "He's been here for a few weeks now. Sweet little guy, but no one's shown much interest in him." Daniel looked at Max, who seemed to sense the significance of the moment. His eyes softened, and he nudged the kennel with his nose, as if to say, "This one deserves a chance too." "Maybe he's been waiting for the right person," Daniel said quietly. The worker tilted her head. "Are you thinking about adopting him?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at Max. "Well, I wasn't planning on it." Max gave a soft bark, as if to nudge him toward the right decision. Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "All right, you win. Max looks like we've got a new addition to the family." When they got home, Daniel set up a small bed for the puppy in the corner of the living room. Max watched with quiet curiosity as the puppy explored his new surroundings, sniffing at the couch and wagging his tail at every corner of the room. "You're the big brother now, Max," Daniel said, watching the two dogs interact. Max gave a gentle wag of his tail and sat down beside the puppy, his calm demeanor instantly putting the younger dog at ease. As the days passed, the bond between Max and the new puppy grew stronger. They chased each other around the yard, curled up together for naps, and followed Daniel wherever he went. It was clear that Max had taken the puppy under his wing, just as he had once taken care of Daniel. One evening, as Daniel sat on the porch with both dogs at his side, he found himself overwhelmed with gratitude. "You've done it again, Max," he said softly, stroking his fur. "You've reminded me that life isn't just about surviving, it's about sharing love, about making a difference for others." Max looked up at him with those same wise, knowing eyes, as if he understood every word. The puppy, now affectionately named Charlie, yawned and snuggled closer to Max, the two of them forming an inseparable pair. Word of Daniel's story continued to spread. The local news ran a feature on Max and his incredible loyalty, and soon, people from all over the country reached out to share their own stories of animals who had saved them in unexpected ways. Daniel began to speak at community events, sharing his journey and the profound lessons he had learned. He encouraged people to adopt animals from shelters, to recognize the power of love, and to never lose hope, even in the darkest moments. "Animals see us for who we are," he said at one event, standing beside Max and Charlie. "They love us unconditionally, and sometimes, They save us in ways we can't explain. Max saved my life, and now I'm dedicating mine to giving back. If my story inspires even one person to hold on a little longer, to love a little deeper, then it's all been worth it." The audience erupted into applause, and Daniel looked down at Max, who wagged his tail happily, his gold medallion gleaming under the stage lights. Years later, Daniel sat in his backyard, watching the sun set over the horizon. Max, now older and slower, lay beside him with his head resting on Daniel's lap. Charlie, full of energy and mischief, chased butterflies across the grass. Daniel smiled softly, his heart full. "You've given me everything, Max," he whispered. "You showed me that love is the most powerful thing in the world." Max's tail thumped gently against the ground, his eyes closing as he let out a peaceful sigh. And as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Daniel knew that no matter what happened, the bond they shared would live on forever. Because sometimes, the greatest miracles aren't the ones we plan for, they're the ones that find us when we need them most. And for Daniel, Max would always be his miracle.